This is the Talking Animal Law podcast, brought to you every 2 weeks by the UK Centre for Animal Law and hosted by Paula Sparks, Director of A-Law. But it's not just for lawyers, it's for anyone who cares about animals. So no matter who you are, if you want to know more about animal protection, news, ethics and animal law reform, then this is the podcast for you.
Today, I am really excited to be talking to Peter Stevenson, the Chief Policy Advisor at Compassion in World Farming. Peter has worked in the animal welfare movement now for almost 3 decades. He's played a leading role in winning the EU bans on veal crates, battery cages and sow stalls, as well as a new status for animals in EU law as sentient beings. He's written well-received publications on the economics of livestock production and the detrimental impact of industrial farming on resources which affect our ability to feed ourselves. He's also a spokesman for farmed animals, has made various appearances across a range of media channels, including BBC Country File, Radio 4, Farming Today, and LBC Radio. Peter, hello.
Hello.
Thank you for your time talking to us today. And firstly, let me just say congratulations, because you have just been awarded an OBE for animal welfare in the 2020 Queen's Birthday Honours List, I understand.
Yes, that came as a surprise.
But a welcome one.
Of course it's nice, and it's nice for me, but it's nice, I think it's helpful for the movement, this recognition that animal welfare is something in which one's work can be kind of recognised in that way. I think it's part of really getting animal welfare established as a core societal issue.
I agree with you. And you've worked in farmed animal welfare in this space for many years.
Yes, I've worked for Compassion in World Farming for 30 years.
30 years.
So yes, it's been a long time.
But I think your degree was in economics and law, is that right?
Yes, it wasn't planned. There wasn't such a thing as economics and law, but I did part 1 for economics. And I was finding it increasingly mathematical, which isn't my strong suit. So then moved over to law. And I think it was just luck that they're both subjects that are, really useful within the world of animal welfare. I mean, law, obviously so. Being a lawyer means that one's, well equipped to help with, drafting amendments, drafting private members' bills.
Yeah.
And private members' bills, though they rarely become law, unless they're totally non-controversial, can be a very effective way of pushing an issue forward. So that back in, I think it was 1990, Sir Richard Boddy, who was a Conservative MP, came second in the annual ballot for private members' bills. And he decided to bring forward a bill to ban sow stalls. And he couldn't easily be criticised because he was a pig farmer. So he was not knowing what he was on about. And, parliamentary time, very limited when it comes to private members' bills, but we got through the second reading. It was forced to a vote and, was voted on. It then, in later stages, ran into MPs trying to talk the bill out. I remember William Hague reading for very long periods from a telephone directory to talk it out. But remarkably, the government at a certain point turned around and said, actually, we agree with this bill. And if it falls as a private member's bill, we'll bring forward our own legislation to ban sow stalls. And they did.
Oh, that's fantastic.
But that would never have happened if there hadn't been that private member's bill.
Yes.
That got it onto the agenda. And as a lawyer, I was able to work with Sir Richard to draft the bill and this kind of thing. So yes, a legal background, helpful in many ways, but the economics background also helpful. Time and again, one is told that governments base their decisions on the science. And I'm talking about governments here and in the, but actually that's not necessarily the case. It's on the economics. And I remember the EU banned barren battery cages back in '99, with a ban due to come to force in 2012. But there was to be a midpoint review, and the industry Europe-wide was pressing very hard for this review to either scrap the ban or at least postpone it till 2020. And we fought against that. And we were able to, because always the argument was, oh, you know, people won't be able to afford non-cage eggs and farmers will be destroyed. Yep. We looked at the economic data published by the industry and saw that although there may be a big price difference in the shops, the on-farm production cost difference between battery and non-cage was really quite small. I looked up the figures again this morning. We calculated, this is many years ago, that it only costs 1.3 euro cents more to produce a free-range egg than a battery.
Right.
Then the number of eggs eaten per person per year, and we're able to calculate that in a year it would cost, sorry, in a week, the extra cost of using non-cage eggs would be 11 euro cents per person per week. So an extra cost, but really very, very small, not this cataclysmic disaster that the industry was trying to suggest. And this was important because we then found that the European Commission itself, in defending the ban, was using our data to show how small the costs were. So yeah, economics too can be really, really important in one's work on animal welfare.
Yes, and as you say, I think having the combination of the economics and law, having the knowledge of both, is tremendously useful, because one without the other
yes.
is much less effective. So did you qualify as a solicitor after taking your law degree?
Yes, I did. I qualified as a solicitor in local government. In those days, it was still the only place that would actually pay you during what was still called articles. So I worked in local government. And then I thought, hold on, I don't necessarily want to do this all my life. This was the 60s, and it was a time of full employment. So one wasn't that worried about giving up a job. So I gave up my job, and I wanted to work in theatre. And as a student assistant stage manager at the King's Head Theatre in Islington at £5 a week, but with a room and food thrown in. And then I started directing, and I worked as a theatre director for 15 years. But by my late 30s, I'd probably come to the end of that. I'd done some good work, but I knew that I wasn't going to go beyond a certain point in terms of quality of work. And then I remembered I was a solicitor. So I went to the Law Society and said, look, you know, how do I get back into the profession?
Yeah.
So we have jobs. And so I started working in the ethics department of the Law Society, and then eventually became assistant legal advisor to the Law Society. And it was during the time of the what became the 1990 Courts and Legal Services Bill. And that's how whether obviously the Law Society was doing lots of lobbying, because the bill was trying to undermine their monopoly on conveyancing and other things. So that's when I began to get some sense of how one lobbies, how one puts an argument across to MPs. But then gradually I was becoming more and more aware of the world of animals. I need to go back a step. My parents arrived in this country in 1939 as refugees from what was then Czechoslovakia.
Right.
I loved animals. And so something there must have rubbed off. But in the late 80s, there was huge concerns about the real danger at that point that the African elephant could become extinct. And that really, I became very aware of that and what we do to animals. And then also at that time in the 80s, I was studying quite a lot under a meditation teacher. And he used to rent schools, other academic establishments during the school holidays. So about 30 or 40 of us would always in the summer go on a 5-week meditation workshop. And it was at a place called St. James in Dorset, and it was beautiful. Stunning gardens, flower beds and trees, and a big long slope down to a river. Lovely place to be. But the other side of the river was a slaughterhouse. probably quite a small local slaughterhouse, but one kept hearing the sounds of animals and the shots of the captive bull that's used to stun them, things like that. And I think that, again, in a subtle way, it wasn't a kind of, a decision at one moment, made me more and more aware of what we're doing to animals. And then I began to feel, yes, I'd like to work in this field. And then I saw an advert from Compassion in World Farming, and that's how I ended up working with them. And it wasn't hard to get a job in those days. Nobody much wanted to work in animal welfare. So that's how I came to work for Compassion in World Farming.
Well,
I can't remember your question now. Very long answer.
Well, I think you've answered it. But what campaigns have you worked on? What sort of areas have you worked on during your time in the Compassion? Which successes are you most proud of?
I'm not sure proud, but I'm pleased. Right, early on, we got this ban on sow stalls.
Yeah.
And that was so important because so often people say, oh, you have to work internationally. I'm very engaged at the moment in debate on the whole future of British farming. And some of the really hardline pro-trade people say, oh, country can never kind of go on its own. It can only work internationally. And yet, if the UK had not gone out on its own with the sow stall ban, I don't think many other things would not have happened. I think that led to the EU eventually banning sow stalls. It's led to, a number of food businesses in other parts of the world and even producers on a voluntary basis moving away from sow stalls. So that was really important. We then, Compassion played a leading role in getting the EU ban on battery cages. And in getting animals recognised in EU law as sentient beings, something that sadly the UK hasn't yet caught up with. And that was of huge symbolic importance. And I remember my very first full day at work, Philip Limbury, who now is Chief Executive of Compassion, and I were tasked to drive a van with 1 million petition signatures from Petersfield, where our headquarters were at that time, to Strasbourg, to the European Parliament. And 1 million signatures, this was paper signatures days, even thought of clicking onto things. There was these 36 boxes, and we drove to Strasbourg and we presented them to the President of the European Parliament. And then followed years of lobbying, and I can't emphasize how important tenacity is. You just keep going from one committee to another to the full Parliament. And eventually there was a declaration added to the then EU treaty. Then a few years later, it became a protocol annexed to the treaty, and eventually a treaty article. And it's really important because not only does it recognise animals as sentient beings, but it requires the member states, when formulating and implementing their policies in certain key areas, including agriculture, to pay full regard to the welfare requirements of animals. So that was terribly important. I think we as lawyers, our movement, should be doing more to take that sentient beings article and make sure it really is respected and adhered to by governments Europe-wide. It's not happening at the moment. Obviously really pleased that we managed to get a ban on veal crates throughout Europe. Again, the law came into this. Peter Roberts, who founded Compassion, long before I joined them, brought a private prosecution against a veal crate farm in the UK. And it attracted huge publicity because it was owned by monks.
Oh.
It was a feeling that Christian monks ought to know better than to treat God's creatures like this. And Peter lost the case. It was a private prosecution, not a judicial review. But within a year, the UK government had banned veal crates. There was such an outcry. And we had a similar experience at the EU level. In the mid-90s in this country, there was huge protests against live animal exports, which at those days was running at 2.5 million sheep and calves a year. And we brought judicial review proceedings against what was still Ministry of Agriculture, arguing that the minister was Waldegrave at that point, was misadvising himself as to the law, that he could ban calf exports if he wanted. He kept saying he couldn't. And that case went from the High Court all the way to the European Court. The Advocate General agreed with us, but sadly the judges didn't. But again, this created huge awareness of what are veal crates in Europe. And again, quite quickly after that, within a year or so, I think, the EU had banned veal crates. So sometimes taking legal action, even if you don't win the case, can somehow propel, can create a kind of drive and momentum.
Yes, and one action I remember that wasn't successful, and no, I think, you know, disappointingly so, was that the action taken by the judicial review taken by Compassion in relation to the broilers. Because, you know, I thought it was really great that you had stood up and raised the awareness around the breeding of broilers and the welfare problems that they have.
Yes, that was a big disappointment. And if one looks to things that, the many things that still need attention, you know, meat, chicken, broiler production is certainly one of them. So there have been a few improvements, but it's in the end a dreadful industry that doesn't remotely regard chickens as sentient beings. They are just units of production. The core problems, apart from just overcrowding, the fact that chickens have been selectively bred over the last 60 or more years to grow very, very quickly. They're probably growing 2 to 3 times more quickly than they were 40 or 50 years ago. What grows quickly, though, is the muscle, the meat. The legs and the heart and lungs don't keep pace with it. And so probably over a quarter of chickens, according to kind of scientific research, are suffering from leg disorders that are highly likely to be painful. And quite a lot die of heart disease. You know, in other words, they can't even get to their slaughter age of 5 to 6 weeks without some of them dying of heart disease. It's an appalling industry. I'm glad we brought the case, but very disappointed that we lost. And in all this current concern, absolutely right concern about chlorinated chicken, indeed the American broiler industry is in certain respects worse than ours. We have to remember that ours too is really poor.
Yes, I agree with that. And I remember the Farm Animal Welfare Council, as it then was in 2009, in their 2009 report, recommended that animals who are farmed should have a life worth living. So the balance of its experiences over its lifetime, the positive should outweigh the negative. Do you think that we have achieved that for farmed animals, or for all farmed animals, or some?
No. That's not to say that there aren't some really good farmers who are achieving this, but as you say, Falk said all animals should have a life worth living, and they said an increasing number should have a good life. And if one begins to think, I mean, so really what they're getting at, or what certain scientists are getting at, is that farm animal welfare isn't just about preventing negative experiences, pain and suffering. Obviously that is crucial, but it's also about giving animals an opportunity to have a positive experience of life. And for me, I've been thinking about this, you know, what do I mean by it? So I think I'm thinking that animals should have fresh air, natural light. They should be able to experience the warmth of the sun on their back, companionship of their own kind, play. They should be able to, you know, rear their young. Their young. They should be able to explore their world and just to engage in the simple tasks of daily life, such as searching for food and building a nest. And some scientists are being very kind of clear. David Meller wrote a paper in which, again, he defined positive experiences as including pleasure and comfort and interest, confidence. I like this idea that animals have confidence, a sense of control over their lives. And a really remarkable Dutch scientist, François Wemmelsvelder, who works at the university, the Scotland's Rural College, has has done a lot of work on looking at what is positive welfare, and she has said that if animals are kept in very kind of barren conditions, they are going to be suffering from boredom and frustration and have no kind of positive quality of life. And yet the majority of farm animals, particularly I'm thinking the pig and poultry sectors in this country and in Europe, are kept in very, very barren, poor conditions. So yes, totally believe in this idea of a good life, a life worth living, but we've a long way to go before we achieve that.
It's a shame. Over your lifetime, have you seen many developments in animal welfare science as a discipline?
Yes, and those developments in science have been really, really important, because if you're asking politicians, either here or in Europe or indeed anywhere, to legislate for change, they want certain assurances. They want to be comfortable that what they're agreeing on is supported by the science. They also want to know that it makes economic sense. We were talking about earlier, it's not going to be an economic disaster. They want to know what are the alternatives. You know, if we ban, shall we say, farrowing crates, what is the alternative system in which sows could farrow and look after their piglets? So the science is certainly one of these kind of core components. And it's been particularly important in, for example, recognizing that decapod crustaceans and cephalopods such as octopuses are capable of experiencing pain and suffering. And this has helped driving the current movement towards having these creatures recognized as sentient beings, as animals. And I really hope that happens.
Yes, I share that hope. And for any of our listeners who don't know, what is a farrowing crate? Because you talked about the sow stalls being banned. So what are the farrowing crates and how are they different?
Okay, so traditionally, though now banned here, sow stalls are where sows are kept during their pregnancy, which is just over 16 weeks. And they're so narrow that the sow cannot even turn round. They've now been banned not just here, but Europe-wide, though sadly Europe still allows the use of sow stalls for the first 28 days of the pregnancy. There's no good reason for that, and the UK has banned it altogether. What the UK still allows, and most of Europe still allows, is a farrowing crate. So farrowing is when the sow gives birth. And so a few days before she gives birth, she's placed in a farrowing crate. She's kept there while she farrows until the piglets are weaned at 3 to 4 weeks of age. And given a sow produces just over 2 litres a year, she's going to be kept like this, not being able to turn around for about 9 to 10 weeks of the year. Now, farmers justify it by saying, well, sows tend to crush their piglets, and therefore we're going to keep them tightly confined so they can't move. But in fact, what are called free farrowing pens, which give the sow a reasonable amount of space, have been designed by UK scientists. And the research shows that actually when they're well designed and well managed, piglet mortality can be as low as, or even lower than in crates. Now, the industry points out rightly that about 40% of UK sows are kept outdoors, so they farrow outdoors, so you don't need these crates. But the 55 to 60% that are kept indoors, nearly all of them are kept in these farrow crates. We keep pressing government to phase them out, and they keep making some slightly promising noises, but there's a lot. I still think we need a big push. But the idea that here we are, that we still, despite all these developments, still keep sows in farrowing crates is appalling. Partly the reason it's happening is because modern sows have been genetically selected to produce huge litters. So they're big, clumsy animals. We perhaps ought to return to a more natural litter size in which you wouldn't have such big sows and they wouldn't be prone to kind of crushing their piglets. I mean, this is the story of factory farming. It introduces certain systems or certain breeding things. This causes problems. And so then solutions to these problems are found, which are very damaging to the animals, rather than saying, okay, so it's this old thing that what time again is happening is that animals are being made to fit the system. So piglets will be tail docked, hens will be beak trimmed, rather than designing systems that actually work for the animals. And quite honestly, if your system for your sows is such that the only way you can stop them crushing piglets is to put them in a crate where they can't turn around, then there's something just inherently wrong with that system. You need to go back to basics and think again.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it seems to me it goes beyond a question of welfare, and it goes to just the intrinsic, it raises intrinsic questions about how we actually interact with animals and the protection that animals have. It goes right back to selective breeding and to shortened lifespans, which I think animal welfare science, traditionally hasn't looked at. It's focused more on the welfare of the animals as they are. But this is also a really important issue.
If you look at the welfare problems, the suffering, most people are aware, rightly, of keeping, because many of our hens are still, the barren cage has been banned, but over 40% are still in so-called enriched cages. We've got the sows in the farrowing crates. We've got massive overcrowding in the chicken industry. But just as important, but people are much less aware of it, is what selective breeding for fast growth rates and high yields has done. So as I said earlier, broilers have been pushed to reach their slaughter weight so quickly that many are suffering from painful leg disorders. The Farm Animal Welfare Council has pointed out that as long as we carry on breeding hens to produce over 300 eggs a year, it will be very difficult to get away from the high level of painful bone fractures suffered by laying hens. In part because to produce that many eggs, they're drawing on the calcium in their own bones to provide eggshells. So their bones are quite brittle and vulnerable to fracture. If you look at dairy cows, the European Food Safety Authority did a huge series of reports on dairy cow welfare about 10 years ago, and then produced on different aspects, and then they produced an overall scientific opinion. And they said the biggest problem facing the health and welfare of dairy cows is genetic selection for high milk yields. Modern cows have been selected to produce 10,000 or more litres a year. It's a huge amount, which they're on a metabolic knife edge. It's making them very vulnerable to high levels of mastitis and lameness. And often after just 3 or 4 lactations, milk cycles, they're so worn out that they have to be prematurely killed. And I have to say that I'm never quite sure how the dairy industry continues to get away with its wholesome image. I mean, farmers are great, but the dairy industry as a whole, a recent study reported that 31% of UK dairy cows are lame, and lameness for these big animals is immensely painful. The industry's own figures a couple of years ago showed that 80 to 90,000 male calves are shot at birth. Roughly 20% of UK dairy cows are now zero grazed. That means they're indoors all year. In winter, of course, one expects in our climate cows to be indoors, but cows should be out at pasture during the grass growing season, but 20% are not. They're indoors all year round. As I say, I think we need some really far-reaching changes to the dairy sector. But again, I need to emphasize that there are some wonderful farmers out there. So the norm in the dairy industry, an unchallenged norm over the years, has been that calves are separated from the cow really on the first day of life. Yeah. The farmer wants the milk, not for the calf, but wants the milk for humans, yeah, not for the calf. But there's wonderful farmers in Scotland who really bucked this trend. and are now keeping the calves with their mothers till 5 weeks of it, till 5 months of age. And again, that's courageous, bucking the trend. It's economically very, very difficult because you're losing an awful lot of milk. And these farmers are called the Finleys. It's a husband and wife team.
Oh.
For all my criticisms of the current state of welfare in the UK, there are some farmers out there who do wonderful jobs. I recently came across 3 UK farmers who were keeping pigs on pasture. There was not just free range, but actually the bulk of the feed was coming from pasture. And these pigs were living wonderful outdoor lives. So we need to really support those farmers who are innovative and courageous.
Absolutely. And traditionally, lawyers have been, real drivers for social reforms and towards social justice. And they still are. Do you see animals and animal interests as being part of that social justice movement that we need to address in terms of any imbalance between human and animal interests?
Oh, yes. I think changing the relationship between people and animals to one in which there's a real respect for animals' needs and wants is one of the many important social justice movements. And these are all crucial. I mean, we've seen some very real progress, but there are still many, many problems. And in some areas, for example, perhaps in terms of racial equality, we're going backwards. And I'm talking not just about the UK, I'm talking about much of the world. But I think the way we relate to animals is an important social justice movement. And indeed, it's not just animals, it's the way we relate to the natural world. I mean, what COVID has certainly taught us is that we need to regain a sense of respect for the natural world and the creatures who are within it. And that if we don't, we are likely to see further pandemics, further problems such as climate change. I mean, to me, it's so important that we recognize that we are part of the natural world, not its masters, and that we, whether it's with other people, whether it's with animals, whether it's with nature, that we learn a sense of gentleness, a sense of kindness, a sense of awe about the beauty of this world we live in. We need very fundamental changes in our approach to our lives and the world.
I would agree with that. And actually, over the last few years, I've heard much more discussion about animals and interconnectedness with other issues such as the environment and labour laws. Those types of issues, actually people recognising that there is often a connectedness between some of these social justice problems that we see in the world. Do you share that view?
Yes, nearly all these problems are related to one another, related to the modern world's inability to respect each other, to respect the world and the creatures within it. And there is huge interconnectedness. And I think within our particular field of animal welfare, neither we in the movement nor politicians, I'm not just talking about the UK, but the EU and worldwide, seem to recognise the link between animal agriculture and arable. And so, yes, we're aware of the welfare problems. And even those within the welfare movement are aware that there's some big environmental problems and that those are largely coming within farming from very industrial ways of growing crops, monocultures and the high use of pesticides and nitrogen fertilizers. Very few people, almost no politicians, recognise or certainly would admit to the link between the two. if you look, the last time I looked at DEFRA figures a couple of years ago, 47% of the cereals, wheat, barley, oats grown in this country were used as animal feed. European Commission figures show it's 50% in the EU. Worldwide, the UN says it's 45%. This is human edible crop used to feed animals. Now, animals convert these very inefficiently into meat and milk. It is just very wasteful. But also, this huge need for cereals has played a big part in driving the intensification of crop production. And with its monocultures and agrochemicals has led to biodiversity loss, soil degradation, overuse and pollution of water. The other thing factory farmed animals need is soy. And it's the need for soy that is driving deforestation. So we need to do much more to recognize the link between animal welfare problems and some of the other huge issues that are currently dominating people's thinking about biodiversity loss and deforestation. And we need to rethink, and this is the only way we'll not just improve welfare, but deal with many of these problems. We need to fundamentally rethink our agriculture. We need to move to what's called regenerative agriculture. In other words, agriculture which can minimize the use of agrochemicals, which certainly in poorer parts of the world can actually boost production. And it does this by supporting and harnessing natural processes. So soil quality can be built not by throwing lots of artificial fertilizers onto it, but by using what are called cover crops and compost and rotations, particularly when those rotations include legumes, plants, crops that can actually fix nitrogen from the atmosphere into the soil. If your soil then includes a good amount of organic matter, that will help retain water, really important in times of drought, but also preventing flooding and preventing nitrogen running off from your soil and into waters and polluting them. And if you've got good organic matter, you're going to be storing carbon in the soil. These regenerative systems can rebuild biodiversity, can bring back pollinators and farmland birds. We can see wildlife thriving again. There are farming systems which crucially can include and should perhaps include animals, which can regenerate our world, above all our soils from which so much else flows, and which also will have very high standards of animal welfare. And the crucial part animals can play in this is they provide manure, which builds soil quality. Manure is a problem in factory farming because you're producing such vast quantities of it that it can't be disposed of on the neighbouring land, and it just causes tremendous pollution problems. So I think, yes, we need to keep pressing for individual welfare reforms. Let's get farrowing crates banned. Let's get enriched cages banned. But let's also recognise we'll only finally get good, positive welfare if there's a total change in the way we farm. And another area, and there's so much for us all still to do, another area I've become tremendously aware of in recent months just, but I think others have been aware for longer, is the role played by big banks, both big commercial banks and big public institutions like the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the International Finance Corporation. They're the ones who are funding factory farming worldwide to the tune of just untold billions of dollars. And we've got to start working with these banks and saying, look, for all sorts of reasons, animal welfare, climate change, deforestation, biodiversity loss, you have to stop funding factory farming. To me, this is what perhaps the real next big thing we have to, as a movement, tackle.
Peter, it's been so lovely talking to you, as ever. And I know that, and others perhaps may not, that you are so generous with your time, and you're always ready to support people who have questions and technical issues. And So thank you for that and for all the work that you've done for animals over the years. It's been tremendous.
Well, thank you. It's been really nice talking and kind of thinking through some of these things. Thanks.
Well, I've really enjoyed it too. Thank you again, Peter, for talking to us and giving us that insight into your career and to the issues that are facing animals who are farmed in this country and elsewhere. Next week, we'll be talking about 2 cases which touch upon the interests of animals, and we'll be hearing from our resident experts, Alan Bates and Francis Allen, who will be talking us through the issues in those cases concerning, respectively, the ivory trade and badger culling.
Talking Animal Law is sponsored by Goldsmith Chambers Animal Rights Team at www.goldsmithchambers.com. This project has been supported by funding from Animal Charity Evaluators Movement grants. For more information about the work of the UK Centre for Animal Law, please go to www.alaw.org.uk.